This is E2B, Energy to Business, a podcast by Opportune, where we bring you in-house expertise that serves all energy sectors. We examine emerging financial and technology trends and provide a broad perspective on ways to stay ahead, create opportunities, and execute market strategies.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of E2B, Energy to Business, an Opportune podcast. I'm your host, Daniel Litwin, the voice of B2B. Happy to be behind the mic once again for some quality conversations with and for our energy professionals out there who are looking for the best and brightest insights on how to maneuver today's complex industry. As we dig into today's conversation with a returning guest, I want to make sure you're getting all of the Opportune podcast content and just other Opportune content that you need to feel fully caught up on the subject and tap into some other quality thought leadership. So to do so, make sure you're heading to our website, opportune.com. Again, opportune.com. And make sure that you're subscribing to Energy to Business on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. So on today's episode of E2B, we're going to be having a conversation with Dave Loucks. He's been on a previous episode, so we're happy to re-welcome him onto the show. And we're going to be chatting standardized measure of oil and gas calculations, or SMOG calculations for short, and how we'll more frequently be referencing it throughout the episode. We're going to be tapping into this for our energy professionals listening in to make sure you're fully caught up on our firm's solutions around SMOG calculations and much more. So for a little more context on Dave Loucks is a principal in Opportune's complex financial reporting practice based in the firm's Denver office. And right now he leads the firm's solutions around SMOG calculations and SMOG solutions, asset retirement obligations, or ARO, and Ascent leases. So Dave, welcome to the program. It's a pleasure getting to chat again. And I understand that you've been meeting with a lot of clients recently to conduct their end-of-year 2021 planning for the, again, standardized measure of oil and gas calculations, or SMOG calculations. Can you give our listeners a brief overview of what these SMOG calculations entail?
The SMOG calc really is a reconciliation of the reserve report year over year. It's done on a volume basis and on a dollars basis. With the volumes, it really is, hey, what are the new wells, the extensions? What did you acquire? What did you divest? What did you produce? And then there's a revision line that really is the plug that makes the roll forward roll. Then on the changes side, there's 12 prescribed categories that a company needs to put the activity in to show how things are moving on a dollar basis as well. And then the SMOG amount really differs from the PV10 amount that the reserve engineers actually lay out, because you also have to put in the impact of income taxes on there. So that's taking the company's tax structure and tax attributes and figuring out how to model in, what the impact of those are. For our friends in Texas who have Texas properties, we do need to put in the Texas margin tax and take into account net operating loss, and Up-C tax structures, all those sorts of things. That comes into play on getting to what the SMOG value is, which is really PV10 less the income tax impact with it.
And as folks in this industry are aware, public exploration and production companies, or E&Ps, are required to do SMOG calculations. But what about some of the other companies out there that might be seeking a SMOG calculation?
We see a number of the private companies do SMOG year after year to be ready for transactions, whether that's a transaction, in today's environment of merging in with a SPAC, selling to a public company, or even if they're doing a debt transaction, sometimes the SMOG calcs are actually required. It also, because it's that reconciliation of the reserve report year over year, some private companies really do it to, make sure that their reserve engineers, really are getting things in the right buckets, right? And it's a good check over that. With a number of calcs that we did during 2021, I really am anticipating a number of transactions to actually get announced here in early 2022.
Well, Dave, I know that 2021 was the year of SMOG for you, at least. How many SMOG calculations did your group actually end up doing this year?
Yeah, we actually completed 110 calculations this past year. Normally we do probably 40 to 60 each year. So that's a pretty big uptick in the number of calcs.
Wow, goodness, that is a lot of SMOG calculations. Why does it make sense to outsource said calculations then to a team like Opportunes?
It really makes sense to outsource the SMOG calculation because it's something that you only do once a year. And, versus, hey, we do these all the time, right? So creating a SMOG workbook is really hard. There aren't any real easy models to follow from the literature to be able to, just sit down and create a workbook to do this. And there's so many moving parts to it. There are a lot of folks that are still using the Arthur Anderson model that was developed up in Denver in the late 1980s. Another benefit to outsourcing it, to Opportune would be that, hey, you get the benefit of seeing what we're seeing at other clients as well too. We probably have someone else in your basin that we're also helping so that we can understand what's going on with your numbers. Do they look and seem right?
Well, it seems like quite a few things have changed then from the 1980s, no?
Yeah, price volatility has really increased in the 2000s. That spreadsheet model really worked well when prices were consistent. And it really developed as a big math calculation. Part of that is, hey, you put accountants and engineers in a room together, probably not the two best groups to sit down and have a big, conversation, right? And so, hey, because it's a reconciliation, in a lot of places, it was the accounting team that actually did this. Some of the companies, it actually was the engineering side that did it. And, it's hard to get it together, right? And, as we, again, look at how this has evolved, the price volatility, has really made us, go back and get a lot more data from the reserve engineers and spend a lot more time with them to understand, hey, this is what the data is saying. This is, what they're trying to tell with the changes in the reserve report year over year, right? And, working your way through those to be able to, if you're going to reconcile from the reserve report to the reserve report, it only kind of makes sense that you use as much reserve data as you can and not do as much math as what we used to do in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s.
All right, Dave, peer forward for us a bit. What would you say we're expecting to see regarding SMOG calculations in 2022?
Well, this year is kind of the opposite of 2019 and 2020. In 2019 and 2020, we saw price decreases in both the years. So your changes in prices and costs, and then also the impact of revisions were both negative, right? It was a big downward price change, and you lost a lot of value because of that. As prices come down and you drop off, certain wells that aren't economic anymore, that also is going to take value away. Now with prices going up, it's just the opposite, right? Hey, we're anticipating that people are going to put more wells on that were uneconomic in the past. Probably a little bit of an uptick on the proved undeveloped locations as well too. Although I think companies really are trying to manage that a little bit better, to really tie it to what their real, rig schedule really is. And I think that's a good thing for the calculations. And, because of the prices going up, obviously we're going to see value being added because of that. And on the revision side, we're anticipating seeing, positive revisions on that end as well.
Now, we've seen inflation tick up recently. Does that impact SMOG calculations in any way? Connect the dots for us.
It does, and I think most companies are going to see an increase, due to inflation on the LOE and on the capital side, both, right? The price of, whenever the price goes up, we normally see the associated service costs go up with it as well, and so it's how does that manage to together with it? And definitely, on the capital side, I think we're going to see an impact of that. Now, it's actually kind of interesting because when prices go up on the capital side, that actually takes away PV10 value, which is actually kind of a little not logical as you kind of think about it, but it's a subtraction as we get to what the PV10 amount is. So the math actually does work out with it. But, we think we're going to see, our capital costs, because of the increases in price, a lot of those actually, should be negative this year, whereas in 19 and 20, they were actually positive. And then also on the LOE side, we think we're still going to see a lot of companies that actually, the LOE is not going to go up that much because they really have programs in place to really, continue to kind of control costs on that end. And so that's a little bit of a mixed bag on that. But I think capital almost across the board, we're going to see go up.
What are some of the key things that you think people can learn from or take away when examining SMOG calculations?
Yeah, the SMOG calculation, I always say, is the most important footnote in an E&P company's financial statements. It really tells the story of what happened during the year. How did the value change from last year to this year? Again, prices are going to go up. This year, on the 12-month SEC average is probably about double what it was last year. So we're going to see an increase in value because of that, right? That's an easy one. That's just price movement. But it's more important to understand what's going on with the company to figure out, hey, what are they doing on the extension side? Are they growing through the drill bit? What are they doing on the acquisition side? How many acquisitions did they do? Does it really mix or change the mix of the properties within the whole reserve database, right? So hey, if I went and bought a new field, is the LOE a whole lot lower in that field versus what we traditionally have within the rest of our reserve population? So looking at those and looking at it analytically to figure out, hey, what makes sense, right? And does this all come together? And the engineering data really match what you think the story of the company really is.
On top of that, Dave, is there anything else that you think people should document in their reserves process?
Yeah, one of the things that the PCAOB was really hot on, over the past few years is, how do you know when you have a database population that you're getting the right report out? And, one of the things that happens with the reserve engineering process, and I know this from my public accounting days as well, we always would kind of talk about the SEC reserve report, which just means, hey, it's a reserve report run at the SEC prescribed prices at that 10% discount rate. We think of that as the reserve report. And it's just a version of the reserve report. You can also have a strip price report. You can have a loss OK report. And a loss OK report is actually really important, with this documentation around, knowing that you have the right population for the report that you're running, because the loss OK report will actually show you all of the well bores and locations that are laid out within the whole database. And basically a loss OK report means that we're not taking economics into a play. We're really just looking at it on a volume basis to figure out how long the volumes are actually going to last. And so that would be the largest population, right? And then depending on where economics are, hey, your strip price report may have a different population what the SEC report is. And I really think companies really need to continue to document that and kind of show what the differences are to help the auditors understand what the population really is.
If you don't mind pulling the curtain back a little for us, what are some of the other things that you talk with clients on in these meetings?
We actually have seen a number of comments over the reserve report letters this past year. A few of them have been over, not having the required components that are required in an external reserve engineer's letter. We also saw a couple letters that have the private company exemption language in there, which really says, hey, a third party should not rely on this report, unless they have, written permission. Well, if you filed it as a public document, people are going to rely upon it, kind of easy on that one. And then the other big one that we always talk about is, are there any exclusions or except fors in the reserve engineer's letter that really would take it out of being, an SEC compliant letter? So, sometimes we see companies still not have the net abandonment costs included, which they should be. And so the letter will say, hey, net abandonment costs are not included. Well, that's pretty easy to see in a letter and go, okay, hey, that's not an SEC compliant letter then. And so you really want to take that time to read the letter and figure out, what those exclusions are and how we need to deal with things, whether that's getting the reserves rerun, or hey, we can, layer the abandonment costs in separately to actually make it an SEC compliant report.
So with ESG, or environmental, social, and governance standards, people in the oil and gas industry are dealing with aspects of this trend all the time. What can a company do to improve the governance of reserves to cover the G component in ESG?
Well, this one's actually kind of an easy one, right? They really just need to meet with the internal and external reserve engineers and actually document it. And I'm really shocked that this isn't happening now. I go back to my public accounting days, and I know, how many audit committee meetings I actually sat through the presentation, that the external reserve engineers would actually make. And so I just kind of assumed that this was still happening. And I, like I said, I'm really shocked that it's not. It's obviously the best governance, to have that meeting. And, whether that's at the board level, at a private company or at a public company, we're seeing a lot of them actually rename their audit committee to be the audit and reserves committee. That ends up kind of being an ESG scorecard item, right? Of, check the box. Hey, they've got a reserve committee, but then we actually do have to have these meetings, and they should, in those meetings, they should be asking, the same questions that they ask, the external auditors of, hey, did you face any undue pressure to achieve a certain result? Would you have done anything differently? Do you think there's fraud and all that kind of stuff? It's kind of the same questions, but I think it's something that really does need to happen, to continue to help improve the process.
And finally, Dave, have you been talking to clients about the energy transition? And if so, how do you think the accounting aspects will develop or should develop around this trend?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I have been asking, clients, with what their thoughts are about, the carbon capture underground storage, and, if they're thinking about getting involved in it. We actually do have a couple of groups that actually, have real carbon capture underground storage, or CCUS deals. And I think it's going to be very, very interesting because, we know how the accounting works when we take things out of the ground. So to do it the opposite of how the accounting is going to work when we put things back in, I think it's going to be very interesting to see how it really does develop and who really are the leaders on that end. And another part with it is how much help do we really need from the reserve engineers as the experts, to tell us, what's really going on with that storage, right? And how much more can they put in, etc. So it definitely is something that we're going to have to continue to evaluate and watch and see how it does continue to develop.
All right. I think on that note, Dave, that does it for our conversation. Thanks again for joining us here on the show. It's a pleasure getting to chat a second time. And thank you so much for laying out all of the most important aspects of SMOG calculations and what our energy professionals tuning in need to take away around these important calculations. Again, folks, we've been chatting with Dave Loucks. He's a principal in Opportune's complex financial reporting practice. And if you want more information on some of this work or you want to get in touch with Dave, head to our website per usual, opportune.com. And thank you everyone for listening to another episode of E2B, Energy to Business. For more episodes, you can also head to our website, opportune.com, or you can subscribe to Energy to Business on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. I'm your host, Daniel Litwin, the voice of B2B, and we'll catch you on the very next episode of E2B.